My name is Ruthie Mae Whitfield. I'm 100 years old. My husband Gene is 100. We've been married 78 years, since 1947. And I know what you're thinking. 78 years. That's beautiful. That must have been a wonderful marriage. It was, eventually. But there were 22 years in the middle that I don't talk about at dinner parties. 22 years where I was the loneliest woman in Knoxville, Tennessee, sleeping right next to a man who loved me and had no idea I was disappearing. Gene Whitfield is a good man. I need you to hear that first, before I tell you the rest. He served in Korea. He carried mail for 38 years through rain, heat, snow. Never missed a day. He fixed everything in our house before I could even mention it was broken. He never raised his hand to me, never once. He was faithful every single day of our marriage, every single day, and for 22 years I was so lonely I could barely breathe. Now, that's not Gene's fault. Not entirely. It's not my fault entirely either. It's what happens when two people love each other but never learned how to sit down and say so. Gene grew up on a tobacco farm in eastern Tennessee. His daddy worked from dawn to dark and never, not once in Gene's whole childhood, said the words, "I love you." Not to Gene, not to Gene's mother, not to anyone. In that house, love was what you did with your hands. You fixed the porch. You brought home the money. You stayed. That was love. You didn't need to talk about it. So when I married Gene, I married that inheritance. I just didn't know it yet. For 22 years, Gene would come home from his route, kiss me on the forehead, same spot every single night, and walk to his workshop. After the workshop, dinner. After dinner, the television. After television, bed. That was our marriage. Every day, for 22 years. And I kept waiting. I waited for him to ask me about my day, to sit down at the table and just talk to me. Not about the kids, not about the house, just about me. About us. I prayed about it. Every night. I said, "Lord, change this man. Teach him to see me." But I never said it to Gene. I hinted. Oh, I was the queen of hints. I'd say things like, "We never talk anymore, Gene." And he'd say, "What do you mean we're talking right now?" And I'd say, "Never mind." And I'd go to bed with that never mind sitting on my chest like a stone. 1,000 never minds. That's what my marriage was for 22 years. 1,000 times I meant everything and said nothing. I want you to hear my part in this. I was waiting for Gene to read a letter I never wrote. I expected him to decode my hints, my sighs, my silence. And when he couldn't, when he just kissed my forehead and walked to his workshop, I told myself he didn't care. But the truth is, I never once sat him down and said, plainly, "Gene, I am lonely in this marriage." Not once. In 22 years. My mama, Lorene Dawson, God rest her, told me something before my wedding. She said, "Ruthie, a good marriage isn't one where you don't get hurt. It's one where you keep choosing to stay at the table." I nodded like I understood. I didn't. I thought she meant endurance, gritting your teeth and surviving. She meant something else entirely, but I wouldn't understand that for another 22 years. Our 20th anniversary, Gene made reservations at the restaurant where he'd proposed. 1967. I got my hair done, wore the blue dress he liked. I thought, I don't know what I thought, that something would be different maybe, that 20 years meant something, and he'd finally say it. We sat in that restaurant for 2 hours. Gene talked about the kids. He talked about the roof needing work. He talked about a new carrier on his route. 2 hours. He never once mentioned our anniversary, never said a word about 20 years together, not a word about me. I cried the whole drive home. Jean looked over and said, "Ruthie, what's wrong?" I said, "Nothing, Jean," and he believed me, because that's what I'd trained him to do. That night I lay in bed and listened to him breathing, and I thought, this is my life. This is all my life is going to be. Lying next to a good man who doesn't know I'm here. I might have stayed in that silence forever. I might have died in it, but in 1969 our daughter Darlene said something I couldn't unhear. She was 17. I was in the kitchen washing dishes. Darlene walked in and stood in the doorway. I don't know what brought it on. Maybe she'd been watching us, watching the silence, longer than I knew. She said, "Mama, I don't ever want a marriage like yours." My hands stopped in the water. I didn't turn around, I couldn't. Darlene walked away. I stood there with my hands in that dishwater, and something broke open in me that I'd been holding together for 22 years. You see, I could survive being lonely. I'd been doing it. I could survive feeling invisible, but I could not survive my daughter learning from me that this is what love looks like, that silence is what marriage sounds like, that you marry a good man and then you disappear. That night I lay in bed and I didn't pray for God to change Jean. For the first time in 22 years I didn't pray that prayer. Instead I thought, what if this is on me too? What if I've been waiting for a miracle when what's needed is a conversation? A few weeks later, I went to see Pastor Leonard Hicks at our church. I sat in his little office with the wood panelling and the window that stuck, and I told him everything, 22 years of it, the loneliness, the silence, the nothings. I told him I was thinking about leaving Jean. Pastor Hicks listened. He didn't interrupt. He didn't quote scripture at me. He just listened, and when I was done, he asked me one question. "Ruthie, have you told Jean what you just told me?" I opened my mouth and closed it, because the answer was no. Not like that, not plainly, not without wrapping it in hints and hoping he'd find it. Pastor Hicks said, "Here's what I want you to try. Sit down with Jean once a week, just the two of you, not about the children, not about the bills, about each other. Ask each other how you really are, and don't get up from that table until you've both been heard." He didn't save my marriage. I want to be clear about that. He just pointed out that I'd been waiting 22 years for Jean to read a letter I never mailed. That next Sunday, and I will never forget this as long as I live, I sat Jean down at our kitchen table after church. He looked confused, a little scared if I'm honest. I said, "Jean, I need to tell you something, and I need you to just listen." And I told him everything. That I had been lonely, that I had felt invisible, that our daughter didn't want a marriage like ours, that I had almost left. Jean didn't speak for a long time. He sat there with his hands flat on the table, those hands that had fixed everything in our house for 22 years, and he was quiet. Then he looked up at me and said, "I didn't know. Ruthie, I swear to you, I didn't know." He wasn't making excuses. He wasn't defending himself. He was shattered, and I understood something in that moment that I'd missed for 22 years. Jean wasn't withholding love. He wasn't choosing silence to punish me. He was giving me everything he had, every repaired faucet, every forehead kiss. Every morning he got up and carried mail through the rain so our children could eat. That was his love. All of it. It's what his father taught him love looked like. showing up, providing, staying. He didn't know there was supposed to be more. No one had ever told him. And I had never told him either. We both sat at that table and cried. Two people who had loved each other for 22 years and had never once said what they actually needed. That first Sunday conversation lasted 3 hours. It was clumsy, painful, full of long silences, but these silences were different from the old ones. These were the silences of two people reaching for words they'd never been taught to use. The next Sunday we sat down again, and the next, and the next. It became our thing, every Sunday, after church, the kitchen table. I'd ask, "How are we, Jean?" And he'd try. Lord, he would try. Sometimes he'd sit there for a full minute before a sentence came out. But he showed up every single Sunday. And for a man who grew up in a house where men didn't talk, that was the bravest thing Jean Whitfield ever did. Braver than Korea. Here's what I learned about that conversation. It doesn't have to be long. It doesn't have to be dramatic. Some Sundays it's 5 minutes. I felt a little forgotten on Tuesday when you didn't ask about my doctor's appointment. "I'm sorry, Ruthie, how did it go?" That's it. That's the whole conversation. But that small hurt, if we hadn't caught it on Sunday, it would have sat in me for a month. And a month turns to a year. And a year turns to 22 years of nothing. The conversation is a net. It catches the small wounds before they harden into something that can't be healed. We've had that conversation every Sunday for 56 years now. Not once have we missed. Not through Jean's surgery. Not through my pneumonia. Not through the year we lost our son, Robert. Especially not that year. And I need to tell you about Darlene, my daughter, the girl who stood in my kitchen at 17 and said she never wanted a marriage like mine. Darlene has been married 48 years now to a good man named Curtis, and every Sunday, Darlene and Curtis sit down at their kitchen table, same ritual, same question. She told me once she was maybe 55. She said, "Mama, I was wrong about what I said. I do want a marriage like yours, the one you built after you almost lost it. That might be the proudest moment of my 100 years. My mama was right. A good marriage isn't one where you don't get hurt. It's one where you keep choosing to stay at the table." She didn't mean endurance. She didn't mean gritting your teeth. She meant the actual table. The sitting down, the showing up, the asking and the listening, week after week, year after year, until the two of you have built something that silence could never build. Now, you're watching this and you're thinking about your own marriage, or your own silence, the thing you haven't said, the question you haven't asked. I know, I can feel it. So I'm going to ask you what Pastor Hicks asked me 56 years ago. Have you told them? Not hinted? Not sighed? Not said nothing when you meant everything? Have you sat down across from them, not side by side on the couch with the television going, but across from them, eyes open, and asked, "How are we?" You don't need 78 years. You don't need to be 100 years old. You need one Sunday, one table, one honest question, and the courage to stay in that chair until you've both been heard. Jean is in the other room right now, probably asleep in his chair. He does that, but come Sunday morning, he'll be at that table, same as every week for 56 years, same as always, and I'll ask him, "How are we, Jean?" And whatever he says, that's where we start. If this reached you today, Share it with someone who needs to hear it. And come back. We've got 78 years of stories left to tell. You don't need 78 years. You don't need to be 100 years old. You need one Sunday, one table, one honest question, and the courage to stay in that chair until you've both been heard. Gene is in the other room right now, probably asleep in his chair. He does that, but come Sunday morning, he'll be at that table, same as every week for 56 years, same as always, and I'll ask him, "How are we, Gene?" And whatever he says, that's where we start. If this reached you today, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And come back. We've got 78 years of stories left to tell.